A recent YouGov poll has shown that Margaret Thatcher is the most popular Prime Minister over the last 50 years. Thatcher ranked number one in the YouGov survey with 29%. The runner-up was Tony Blair with 12%, while no other figure scored above 6%. Now, it's a list which consists mostly of bad prime ministers, including David Cameron. Remember, he oversaw the deaths of 330,000 people due to austerity. Now, despite Thatcher winning the poll, it by no means shows that she's universally revered. Many took to Twitter to voice their opinion. Margaret Thatcher is dead, and they couldn't bury her deep enough. Destroyed hope and communities in equal measures. Happy birthday to Margaret Thatcher, who would have been 100 years old today, were it not for the fact that she's dead. Happy 100th birthday, Margaret Thatcher. Ding dong, the witch is still dead. Let's hope she stays that way. Now, I'm sure many of you will remember the song Ding Dong, the Witch Is Gone. That got to number 2 in the charts when she died. Now, many continue to mock her after death because people rightfully hate Thatcher, the architect of the UK neoliberal project. Thatcher's free market reforms, dubbed Thatcherism, coincided with a sharp rise in income inequality in Britain. The UK's Gini coefficient, 0 meaning total equality, jumped from 0.253 in 1979 to 0.339 by 1990, one of the fastest increases in inequality on record. Alongside inequality, poverty rates climbed dramatically under Thatcher. In 1979, roughly 13% of Britons lived in relative poverty, below 60% of median income. By 1990, that had risen to about 22%, over 12 million people living in poverty. The era saw mass unemployment, joblessness topped 3 million, the highest since the Great Depression in the early 1980s, and social safety nets were tightened. Now, part of the neoliberal reforms was the mass privatisation of our public services. This included steel, railways, airways, airports, and aerospace, and of the utilities, gas, electricity, telecoms, and water. The working class was a target, right? None of this was about sound economics. In fact, she claims that economics was simply the method in which to change society. Economics are the method. The object is to change the soul. And that she did, by the way. I mean, she used economics to destroy the working class. She smashed the miners and described striking workers as the enemy within. And one of the staple policies which we are still living through was right to buy. Now, this system created winners and losers, elevating some people from the working class by allowing renters in council houses to buy them for a discounted price. This then made a whole host of landlords in which those properties were rented back to other members of the working class. This policy was deliberate in dividing the working class, and it worked. But what didn't work was the property-owning democracy she wanted. We are still living in a housing crisis that links directly back to her. 42 years later, the property-owning democracy she craved is receding from view. When Right to Buy was launched as part of the Housing Act 1980, 55% of householders were homeowners. The figure peaked at 72% in the early noughties, but currently stands at 65%. Meanwhile, council housing has decreased too. In 1979, there were 6.5 million council homes. Now, there are 2.2 million, while 4.4 million households rent privately, twice as many as 15 years ago. Now, Thatcher wasn't particularly popular when she was PM. In fact, her government, after just 3 years, were nearly on the brink. That was until the Falklands. This rescued her government and her popularity increased. None of these changes, right? Or none of this changes the fact that Thatcher changed Britain forever and was still living under neoliberalism 45 years later. Louisa, why do you think, despite everything, Thatcher is the most popular Prime Minister?
I think this is so interesting, obviously, because not only is my PhD on nostalgia, and I think this particular poll really represents this sense of a nostalgia for not only the era of Thatcher, but a pre-Thatcher time. But it makes me think of something that my nana says, and she said, for as much as, I mean, Thatcher destroyed. She was a cleaner. Like, she's very, very working class, and they've felt the brunt of Thatcherism more than anyone. But the one thing she always says is, Thatcher said she would do something and she would do it. She represented this iron lady. I think she represented the last sort of government or power in government that was tangible and that people could actually see and feel. And obviously, she relinquished all this power to the markets. Now politics feels so disenchanted because they don't have a lot of power. That power is entirely to the market. And I think she probably represents like the very last stage of when power was within people. Obviously, she deregulated the market, she deregulated government, and she removed people from power. And obviously, we hit finance now rules. And I think as well the need and want for a strong man in the era that we're in now, where we feel so powerless and there is that aggrievement. I think Thatcher, the Iron Lady, really speaks to that one in need as well. But obviously, it does come from aggrievement, and not from this place of like understanding what she actually did.
No, I think that's probably true. I think one thing we know is politicians of the last 10, 20 years, they don't seem to do anything, right? And I think people want problem solvers. They want solutions. And for all of Thatcher's faults, you can't call her incompetent. And I think we've had a slew of politicians who say they're going to do something, don't quite do it. And there is that nostalgia to a politician who's really strong, because let's be honest, people respect strength. I think part of Trump's sort of rise is that I think he's a pretty weak man, if you ask me, but that that veneer of strength, right? And I think people look back at Thatcher and say, well, she did something. She changed Britain. Of course, she changed it in a very bad way. Actually, I mean, obviously, look, you're well versed on neoliberalism. I mean, what do you think is about Thatcher and her policies that changed Britain forever? That even 45 years later, she can poll number one as Prime Minister?
I think she represented a time that people they believed in politics. And I don't think people do believe that. I feel like the disenchantment we are seeing, and the distrust we have in government, in politics, in ourselves as well, to be able to have any change, is something that speaks to that. And I think Thatcher in particular, like, obviously we've had all her deregulation and the climate crisis, direct result of what how she deregulated these markets and said, we don't care about health and safety, and that's eroded and eroded and eroded. I think that's probably the biggest impact she's had, is not only are we living past neoliberalism, like this is like the end days of neoliberalism, and it's a zombie. It just keeps going on and on and on. Like, it died in 2008, but there was no other ideas around at the time to pick up. And I think it's the relentlessness of neoliberalism. She said over and over again, there's no alternative. And I think that is the very idea that we feel, and even politicians feel, like we just have to keep continuing with this, government, this politics, this economic method, because there's no other option when we really, really need to think of other options. Like, I don't know if anyone's heard of socialism, guys, or, all these other alternatives that we need to be putting thought and effort into thinking about. But where, again, does this imagination machine happen? And she's from what she did, we've had the financialization of the universities and these spaces like libraries and community centres where these sorts of ideas are cultivated. And I think possibly one of the biggest impacts she has is the disimagination machine is manufactured ignorance that we've seen from the dismantling and financialization of education. I mean, obviously, I work in education, and they talk about these Mickey Mouse degrees now, and it's like, get your money's worth out of your degree. You know, it's not about critical thinking, or it's not about, it's a personal investment. And that individualism, that's individualization of education, which is a public good,